The frightening thing wasn't what happened in that cafeteria. It was how many warnings came before it. The sound of a metal food tray spinning across the polished floor echoed through the grand commons of Orion Central Academy long after it should have stopped. Thousands of students filled the massive chamber, yet not a single voice rose above a whisper. The artificial sky above the transparent dome glowed with the pale blue light of a distant gas giant, casting long reflections across rows of tables and suspended walkways. Normally, the academy cafeteria sounded like a small city. Conversations in 100 languages overlapped. Service drones floated between tables. Holographic menus flickered above food stations. Today, none of that mattered. Every eye in the room was fixed on a single figure. Emma Carter stood alone near the center aisle. She was not the tallest student present, not the strongest looking. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, with simple brown hair tied back and an ordinary gray academy uniform, she looked like someone most people would forget 5 minutes after meeting her. Yet nobody was looking away. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Not from fear, not from anger, from something much harder to identify. Around her, dozens of students remained frozen in place. A group of engineering cadets stared over half-finished lunches. 2 instructors stood near the entrance, exchanging uneasy glances. Even the hovering maintenance drones seemed strangely still as their sensors tracked the scene unfolding below. Emma lowered her eyes toward the floor. The bright academy lights reflected in the polished surface beneath her boots. She looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted, like someone who had spent a very long time carrying a weight nobody else could see. A nearby student swallowed hard. Another quietly stepped backward. No alarm sounded. No emergency teams rushed in. The silence itself felt heavier than any siren could have. Emma finally spoke. Her voice was calm, almost disappointingly calm. I told him to stop. The words drifted through the cafeteria and settled over the crowd. Nobody answered. Nobody challenged her. Several students exchanged nervous looks, as though hearing the sentence somehow made everything worse. Across the room, a large display screen continued scrolling academy announcements no one was reading. Scholarship deadlines, flight simulator rankings, upcoming interspecies diplomacy seminars. Normal things. Things from a world that felt very far away now. An older professor near the faculty section removed his glasses and stared at Emma with an expression that looked disturbingly close to recognition. Not surprise, recognition, as if something he had feared for years had finally happened. His gaze shifted toward a sealed security door at the far end of the chamber where academy officials were beginning to gather. They spoke quietly among themselves. None seemed eager to approach. Emma noticed them, but made no move to leave. She simply stood there beneath the blue glow of the artificial sky, shoulders slightly slumped, looking more sad than victorious. That detail unsettled many witnesses later. People expected anger. They expected pride. They expected a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they saw regret. Deep, unmistakable regret. A freshman sitting 3 tables away would later describe it as the expression of someone who had spent months trying to prevent a disaster and had finally run out of options. The observation would spread quickly through academy networks in the days that followed. But none of them knew the full story yet. None of them understood why a quiet human girl had become the center of the largest incident in academy history. None of them knew about the warnings, the reports, the conversations hidden inside sealed personnel files. Most importantly, none of them knew who Emma Carter really was. As the silence stretched longer, the massive cafeteria seemed to shrink around her. The air felt colder. The lights felt harsher. Somewhere in the distance, a service bell chimed the start of the next academic period. No one moved. Emma slowly closed her eyes and released a breath she seemed to have been holding for a very long time. 48 hours earlier, she had been just another student trying to stay invisible. 48 hours earlier, the first thing Emma Carter noticed every morning was the temperature. Orion Central Academy maintained its interior climate at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable for most species in the Alliance. To Emma, It always felt slightly warm. The corridor outside her dorm hummed with the soft vibration of air recyclers hidden behind silver wall panels. Students hurried past carrying data pads and breakfast containers, while overhead displays projected schedules in 12 different languages. Emma stepped into the flow of traffic without speaking to anyone. That was how she preferred it. Invisible was comfortable. Invisible was safe. A group of first-year cadets nearly collided with her near the transit lift. They apologized quickly and continued on their way without recognizing her. Emma considered that a successful start to the day. She arrived at lecture hall 5 minutes early and chose her usual seat in the back corner. Not because she disliked people. Quite the opposite. She enjoyed watching them. The academy was a gathering place for hundreds of civilizations. Feathered scholars debated physics with crystalline mathematicians. Four-armed engineers argued with aquatic diplomats through translation implants. Every day felt like a living museum of intelligent life. Emma genuinely loved it there, which was why she worked so hard not to become part of the conversation. The lecture concerned interstellar conflict resolution. Professor Darius Vance paced slowly across the illuminated stage while holographic star maps rotated above his head. Most students struggled to stay awake. Emma listened carefully. Conflict fascinated her. More specifically, she was fascinated by how often it could be avoided. Halfway through class, the professor asked a question. No one answered. Finally, Emma raised her hand. The room turned toward her. She immediately regretted it. Sometimes people create conflict because they misunderstand restraint, she said quietly. They mistake patience for weakness. Several students exchanged glances. Professor Vance froze for a fraction of a second before nodding. An interesting observation, Miss Carter. Emma lowered her eyes and wished she had remained silent. After class, she left quickly and headed toward the academy gardens. The gardens occupied nearly 2 acres beneath a transparent biodome filled with imported plants from dozens of worlds. It was one of the few places where students rarely gathered during midday hours. Emma sat beside a shallow, reflecting pool and opened a digital textbook. For almost 20 peaceful minutes, nothing happened. Then she heard laughter. Loud laughter. The kind designed to attract attention. She did not need to look up to know who it was. Everyone at Orion Central Academy knew who it was. Cale Vorth had a voice that carried across entire rooms. He was a champion athlete, a senior cadet, and one of the most recognizable students on campus. People admired him. People followed him. People avoided disagreeing with him. His group entered the garden path behind her. Their conversation echoed across the water. Emma continued reading. She had become very good at pretending not to notice things. Unfortunately, Cale had become very good at noticing people who ignored him. The laughter stopped. Footsteps approached. Shadows crossed the pages of her book. Emma slowly looked up. Cale stood several feet away with 3 other students behind him. He smiled confidently. The expression seemed practiced. "You are the human from Earth, right?" he asked. Emma nodded once. "Emma Carter. You never talk to anyone." "I talk when I have something worth saying." One of the students behind him snorted. Cale appeared amused. Interesting answer. For a moment, Emma thought the conversation might end there. She hoped it would. Instead, Cale studied her with growing curiosity, like someone examining a puzzle. "You know," he said, "people keep telling me humans are supposed to be impressive." Emma closed her textbook. Somewhere deep inside, a small feeling of concern began to stir. Not fear, recognition. The feeling a person gets when they see distant storm clouds forming on the horizon. "I am sure they have their reasons," she replied calmly. Cale smiled wider. "Maybe." Then he turned and walked away. Most students would have forgotten the encounter by dinner. Emma did not, because the moment he looked at her, she had seen something familiar in his eyes. Curiosity. And curiosity, she had learned long ago, was often where trouble began. The next morning began with rain. Not real rain, of course. Orion Central Academy used atmospheric projectors to simulate weather patterns inside several of its larger biodomes. Tiny droplets drifted across the transparent ceiling of the central courtyard while students crossed elevated walkways, carrying steaming drinks and glowing datapads. Emma watched them from a second-floor observation deck outside the library. The artificial rain created soft tapping sounds against the glass above her head. She liked that sound. It reminded her of Earth. Not the Earth shown in recruitment brochures or tourism advertisements. The real Earth. Wind, storms, seasons, places where nature did not ask permission before making itself known. Her datapad rested open on the table beside her, displaying assignment notes she had not read for the past 15 minutes. Her attention remained fixed on the courtyard below, more specifically, on a group of students gathered around Cale Vorth. Even from a distance, he attracted attention effortlessly. People laughed when he laughed. They listened when he spoke. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life being told he was exceptional. Emma knew the type. Every academy had them. Every military program had them. Every world had them. Usually they matured. Sometimes they did not. Unfortunately, Cale appeared to belong to the second category. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You should stop sitting alone." Emma looked up. Professor Darius Vance stood beside her table holding a ceramic coffee mug. Steam drifted upward through the cool air. "Good morning, Professor," Emma said. That was not an answer. She smiled faintly. "Then no, I should not." The professor pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply listened to the artificial rainfall. Finally, Vance studied her carefully. "You know, most students spend years trying to stand out." "I'm aware. You spend years trying to disappear." Emma glanced toward the courtyard again. "It is quieter that way." The professor followed her gaze. His eyes settled briefly on Cale. A shadow crossed his expression. Sometimes disappearing attracts attention, too. Emma understood exactly what he meant. "I will be fine. That answer worries me more than it should." Before she could respond, the academy bell sounded through the courtyard speakers. Students immediately began moving toward their classrooms. Cale and his group headed toward the western corridor. For a brief moment, his eyes lifted toward the observation deck. The distance between them was nearly 200 feet, yet Emma felt his attention lock onto her immediately. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a hostile one either. A curious smile. The kind of person gives when they believe they have found an interesting problem to solve. Then he disappeared into the crowd. Professor Vance watched the exchange in silence. "Have you considered requesting a transfer?" Emma almost laughed. "Because one student likes causing trouble? Because one student seems unusually interested in you? That will pass." The professor looked unconvinced. Later that afternoon, Emma entered the academy cafeteria carrying a simple lunch tray. The massive chamber buzzed with conversation and movement. Hundreds of students occupied long rows of tables beneath suspended gardens and floating light fixtures. She selected her usual seat near the edge of the room and began eating quietly. 10 minutes passed peacefully. Then a shadow fell across her table. Emma looked up. Cale stood there. Several students immediately turned to watch. Others pretended not to notice while listening closely. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. Emma glanced at the dozens of empty seats nearby. "You clearly have already decided." His grin widened. "Fair point." He sat down. The students accompanying him remained standing behind the table. Emma recognized none of them personally, though she had seen their faces before. Cale leaned back in his chair. "I asked around about you." Emma continued eating. "That sounds inefficient. Nobody knows much. Then your investigation was unsuccessful." One of the students behind him laughed. Cale ignored the interruption. "You came from Earth 2 years ago. Your academic scores are excellent. Your disciplinary record is perfect. No clubs, no social groups, no competitions." He tilted his head slightly. "Do you know how strange that is?" Emma set down her fork. "Compared to what?" "Compared to everyone else." The answer seemed to satisfy him less than it should have. His eyes narrowed slightly. Around them, conversations began fading as nearby students sensed tension forming. Emma noticed the change immediately. So did Cale. The difference was that Cale appeared to enjoy it. "You know what I think?" he asked. Emma sighed quietly. "I suspect you are about to tell me." More laughter came from his surrounding tables. Cale smiled. "I think you are hiding something." Emma met his gaze for several seconds. Then she picked up her drink. "Everyone is hiding something." For the first time since the conversation began, Cale had no immediate reply. The smile remained on his face, but something else appeared behind it now. Determination. Whatever curiosity had begun in the garden was becoming something stronger. And deep inside, that familiar feeling returned. The distant storm clouds on the horizon seemed a little closer than before. By the following morning, the atmosphere around Orion Central Academy had changed in ways most students could not quite explain. Nothing obvious had happened. No official complaints had been filed. No disciplinary hearings had been scheduled. Yet people had begun paying attention. The reason was simple. Cale Vorth had chosen a target, and unlike everyone else, Emma Carter refused to react the way he expected. The training complex occupied nearly half a square mile on the eastern side of campus. Massive gravitic chambers allowed students from different worlds to practice under customized environmental conditions. Some trained in high gravity, others trained underwater or in controlled atmosphere pressure zones. Emma normally visited the complex before sunrise when it was nearly empty. She preferred silence. She preferred routines. She preferred not being watched. Unfortunately, that morning she was no longer alone. As she stepped onto the indoor running track, she immediately noticed several students leaning against the observation railings above. Their conversations quieted when they saw her. Others glanced in her direction before pretending to focus on their own exercises. Emma knew exactly why. Word traveled quickly inside academies, especially when boredom met curiosity. She completed her warm-up without acknowledging anyone. 1 mile became 2. 2 became 3. Her breathing remained steady. Her pace remained consistent. The display panels along the track recorded every lap. Most students eventually stopped what they were doing and began checking the numbers. Emma ignored them. She had spent years ignoring attention. Then a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "That is actually impressive." Cale stood near the entrance with several friends. Unlike the previous encounters, he did not sound mocking. He sounded genuinely surprised. Emma slowed to a walk and reached for a towel. "Thank you." Most species struggle under Earth standard endurance metrics. Most species are not from Earth. Cale smiled. "Fair enough." Several students nearby expected an argument. Instead, they watched an unusually normal conversation unfold. That seemed to frustrate them. It also seemed to frustrate Cale. Emma could see it happening. Every response she gave deprived him of the reaction he wanted. He would make a joke. She would answer calmly. He would tease. She would remain polite. He would provoke. She would simply move on. The pattern repeated throughout the day. In class, he interrupted discussions to challenge her opinions. Emma answered respectfully. In the cafeteria, he sat across from her again. Emma continued eating lunch. During a group simulation exercise, he publicly questioned whether humans deserve their reputation for adaptability. Emma congratulated another student for solving the assignment and ignored the bait entirely. By evening, people had begun talking about it. Not because of Cale, because of Emma. "Why does she never get angry?" one student asked during dinner. "Maybe she is scared," another suggested. "No," a third replied. "Scared people look different." The rumors spread through dormitories and study halls. Some students believed Emma lacked confidence. Others believed she was hiding exceptional intelligence. A few speculated that she came from a wealthy family or secret government program. None came close to the truth. Late that night, Professor Vance sat alone in his office reviewing personnel records. The room glowed with pale blue monitor light. Outside the panoramic window, orbital traffic crossed the stars in silent streams. The professor opened a classified file. His expression darkened immediately. He read the first page, then the second, then the warning notices attached near the end. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Please do not make me write," he whispered to the empty office. Meanwhile, across campus, Emma sat alone beside the reflecting pool in the Biodome Gardens. The artificial moonlight shimmered across the water. Students laughed somewhere in the distance. Wind machines stirred the leaves overhead. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful again. Then she noticed a reflection approaching across the surface of the pool. She did not need to turn around. She already knew who it was. Kale stopped several feet behind her. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. Finally, he folded his arms and looked out across the water. "Do you know what bothers me?" he asked. Emma sighed quietly. "I suspect you're going to tell me. You never seem worried." She considered the question carefully. Everyone worries about something. Not like everyone else. Emma stared at the rippling reflections dancing across the water. For a moment, her expression became strangely distant. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people learn that worrying does not change the outcome." Kale studied her face. For the first time since they met, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. The storm clouds were closer now. Neither of them could see the future yet, but somewhere ahead, something had already begun moving. The following day arrived beneath a pale, artificial sunrise projected across the Academy's eastern dome. Soft amber light spilled through thousands of transparent panels, washing the campus in colors that almost looked natural. Students crossed plazas carrying breakfast containers and assignment tablets. Service drones drifted overhead. Shuttle traffic moved beyond the distant glass, ceiling like silver insects crossing a bright sky. Everything appeared normal. Emma knew better. Some changes announced themselves loudly. Others arrived quietly and settled into place before anyone noticed. Kale had stopped trying to provoke a reaction. That worried her more than the earlier attention ever had. During morning lectures, he no longer interrupted her. During lunch, he sat elsewhere. During training periods, he barely acknowledged her existence. Most students interpreted the change as boredom. Emma did not. Curiosity rarely disappeared that quickly. It simply changed direction. By midday, she found herself inside the Academy Archive wing researching diplomatic history for an assignment. The archive occupied 3 subterranean levels beneath the central library. Cool air flowed through narrow aisles lined with illuminated data columns. The silence there felt different from other parts of the Academy. Older, heavier, like the building itself remembered things. Emma preferred it. She settled into a study terminal and began reviewing historical treaty records. Nearly an hour passed before a familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "Miss Carter." She looked up. Professor Vance stood beside the terminal. His expression carried none of its usual calm. "Professor, walk with me." Emma immediately closed the file. Something in his tone left little room for questions. They moved through several corridors before reaching a small faculty observation lounge overlooking the Western Gardens. No students were present. The door sealed quietly behind them. Professor Vance crossed the room and activated a privacy field. Blue light shimmered briefly across the walls. Emma felt her stomach tighten slightly. "What happened?" she asked. The professor stared through the window for several seconds before answering. "I reviewed your file again last night." Emma remained silent. "Do you know how many classification levels exist above faculty clearance?" "Several. Your records exceed all of them." The room grew quiet. Outside, students walked beneath flowering alien trees, completely unaware of the conversation taking place above them. Professor Vance folded his arms. "I spent 20 years serving in Alliance military intelligence." Emma said nothing. "I have reviewed records involving espionage, covert operations, first contact incidents, and planetary conflicts." His eyes settled on hers. "I have never seen a student file sealed the way yours is." Emma looked away first. "Then perhaps you should stop looking." The professor almost smiled. "That sounds remarkably similar to advice I received from someone much higher up the chain." Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, he stepped closer. "Kale has been asking questions." Emma nodded. "I assumed he would." He submitted 3 separate access requests, and all denied. That surprised her slightly. Most Academy records were easy enough to access through unofficial channels. Apparently, hers were not. Professor Vance lowered his voice. "Listen carefully. Whatever history follows you here, I do not need to know it. He paused. But I think you should consider leaving campus for a few days. Emma stared at him. Because a student is being annoying? Because I have a feeling this is heading somewhere neither of us wants. The concern in his voice was genuine. That made it harder to dismiss. Before Emma could respond, her communicator vibrated softly. A campus-wide notification appeared. Interdepartmental leadership exercises. Student volunteers requested. Location: Central Arena. Attendance encouraged. The professor glanced at the message and frowned immediately. Kale is leading one of the demonstrations. Emma slipped the communicator back into her pocket. Then I suppose the arena will be crowded. Emma. She looked up. Yes. Professor Vance hesitated. For the first time since she had known him, he seemed uncertain about what to say. Some people spend their lives trying to prove how strong they are. Emma waited. The professor exhaled slowly. The truly dangerous people spend their lives making sure nobody finds out. A strange expression crossed Emma's face. Not amusement, not discomfort, something closer to sadness. That sounds like experience talking. It is. Outside the observation window, the academy bell sounded across campus. Students began moving toward the arena. Somewhere among them was Kalevorth. Somewhere among them, questions were becoming obsessions. And somewhere beyond both of them, a future event was moving steadily closer with every passing hour. Emma felt it the same way sailors once sensed storms beyond the horizon. Invisible, distant, unavoidable. The central arena could hold nearly 10,000 spectators, and by late afternoon, it looked as though half the academy had decided to attend. Rows of elevated seating curved around a massive circular floor where leadership exercises, tactical simulations, and public demonstrations were regularly conducted. Bright white lights illuminated the polished surface below, while enormous display screens hovered overhead, projecting scores, schedules, and participant statistics. Emma arrived through a side entrance and chose a seat high above the arena floor. From there, she could observe without being observed. At least that was the plan. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Students from dozens of species filled the seats. Conversations echoed through the chamber like distant waves. Vendors moved through the aisles selling drinks and snacks. Everything felt festive, ordinary. Yet Emma could not shake the feeling that she was watching people gather beneath darkening clouds they could not yet see. The first demonstrations passed without incident. Cadets presented navigation strategies. Engineering teams showcased emergency response systems. Tactical groups competed in simulated rescue operations. Applause rose and fell throughout the arena. Emma found herself relaxing slightly. Perhaps Professor Vance had been wrong. Perhaps she had been wrong as well. Then Kale entered the arena floor. The reaction from the audience was immediate. Cheers erupted from several sections. Students leaned forward in their seats. Even instructors appeared interested. Kale acknowledged the crowd with an easy confidence that came naturally to him. He moved to the center platform and began leading a public leadership exercise involving volunteer participants from multiple departments. At first, everything proceeded smoothly. Kale spoke clearly. The volunteers followed instructions. The audience remained engaged. Then a mistake occurred. One of the younger students participating in the exercise misunderstood a command sequence. The error was minor. Nothing dangerous. Nothing unusual. Yet the atmosphere shifted immediately. Emma noticed it before anyone else seemed to. Kale stopped speaking. The smile disappeared. The volunteer froze beneath the attention of thousands of spectators. He looked young, nervous, probably a first-year student, the kind still learning how overwhelming public mistakes could feel. Kale approached him and began asking questions. The words themselves sounded reasonable enough, but the tone carried something sharper underneath. The young student struggled to answer. His confidence visibly faded with every passing moment. The audience grew quieter. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others watched with fascination. Nobody intervened. Emma felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. She had seen situations like this before. Not here. Not at the academy. Somewhere else. Somewhere she preferred not to remember. On the arena floor, the student's hands trembled slightly as he attempted to explain himself. Kale continued pressing for answers. The exercise had stopped being educational several minutes ago. Now it felt personal. Emma glanced around the arena. Hundreds of people were watching. Dozens of instructors were present. Yet everyone seemed trapped by the same invisible force. Nobody wanted to become the next target. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A training instructor years ago. A frightened recruit standing alone. A lesson about power that had nothing to do with strength. Emma closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the scene below remained unchanged. The younger student looked smaller somehow. Kale looked increasingly frustrated. The crowd remained silent. Then Emma noticed something else. Near the opposite side of the arena, Professor Vance had risen from his seat. Their eyes met across the distance. The expression on his face made her stomach tighten. He was not watching Kale. He was watching her. The professor already knew what she was thinking. He knew because he had spent the past 2 days studying warning signs. Emma slowly stood. Around her, nobody paid attention. All eyes remained fixed on the arena floor. She stepped into the aisle and began descending toward the lower levels. One section, then another. The noise of the crowd seemed strangely distant now. Somewhere overhead, the giant display screens continued projecting statistics nobody cared about anymore. Halfway down the stairs, her communicator vibrated. A private message appeared on the screen. It came from Professor Vance. Only 3 words. "Walk away, Emma." She stared at the message for several seconds. Then she looked back toward the young student standing alone beneath thousands of watching eyes. The arena lights felt brighter. The air felt colder. And for the first time since arriving at Orion Central Academy, Emma Carter realized the storm had finally reached the shoreline. Emma reached the arena floor just as the silence became impossible to ignore. 10,000 spectators filled the seats, yet the enormous chamber felt strangely empty. The young volunteer stood frozen near the center platform, struggling to find words while every display screen in the arena magnified his discomfort. Kale stood across from him, waiting. The exercise had stopped being about leadership long ago. Now it had become a test of pride. Emma stepped onto the polished surface and began walking forward. At first, nobody noticed. Then a few heads turned. Conversations faded. A ripple of attention spread outward through the crowd. Professor Vance watched from the stands with one hand pressed against the railing. Emma could almost hear his warning again. "Walk away, Emma." She understood why he had sent it. He believed stepping forward would make things worse. The problem was that she had spent most of her life watching people step back when they should have stepped forward. The distance between her and the platform gradually disappeared. Kale noticed her approach and paused mid-sentence. The young volunteer looked relieved simply to see someone else standing nearby. Hundreds of students leaned forward in anticipation. Some expected an argument. Others expected embarrassment. A few hoped for entertainment. Emma stopped several feet away from the platform. Her expression remained calm. Her hands rested loosely at her sides. The arena lights reflected across the polished floor around her shoes. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Kale smiled. "I was wondering when you would decide to join us." A few nervous laughs echoed through the audience. Emma glanced briefly toward the younger student. "You should return to your seat," she said gently. The student hesitated. Then he nodded and quickly stepped away from the center of the arena. Thousands of eyes followed him. Then they returned to Emma. Kale folded his arms. "You seem very interested in my demonstration." "Not the demonstration." "Then what?" Emma took a slow breath. "The lesson." The smile on Kale's face weakened slightly. Around them, the giant display screens continued showing leadership metrics and performance scores that suddenly felt irrelevant. "And what lesson is that?" he asked. Emma looked around the arena. She looked at the students, the instructors, the observers, the people who had remained silent because remaining silent was easier. The difference between proving strength and needing everyone else to believe you are strong. The words settled heavily over the crowd. Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Kale's expression hardened. "You think that is what this is about?" "I think you already know what this is about." For the first time since entering the arena, uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. It lasted less than a second, but Emma saw it. So did Professor Vance. Cale stepped down from the platform. The distance between them narrowed slightly. No alarm sounded. No security officers intervened. The entire academy seemed to be holding its breath. You know, Cale said, everyone talks about humans differently. Emma remained silent. Some say your species is dangerous. Others say your species is overrated. He studied her carefully. I wanted to find out which one was true. A faint sadness crossed Emma's face. And did you? The question lingered between them. Cale opened his mouth, then stopped. Because for the first time since they met, he seemed to realize something important. Emma had never tried to impress him, never tried to challenge him, never tried to win. Every conversation, every encounter, every opportunity for conflict had ended the same way. She had walked away. The realization spread across the arena almost as quickly as it spread across Cale's face. The crowd began seeing the pattern at the same moment he did. Emma had not been avoiding him because she feared him. She had been avoiding him because she had nothing to prove. Somewhere high above, a service drone drifted silently beneath the ceiling lights. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Emma looked directly at Cale and said the words that would later appear in dozens of witness statements. Walk away. Her voice was quiet, calm, almost kind. The arena fell completely silent. And for the first time since this story began, Cale Vorth did not look confident at all. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The arena remained suspended in absolute silence beneath the bright white lights. 10,000 spectators watched the two students standing at the center of the polished floor. Emma's words continued to linger in the air long after she had spoken them. Walk away. It had not sounded like a threat. That was what unsettled people most. It sounded like advice. Cale stared at her. The confidence that normally surrounded him seemed thinner now, as though something invisible had cracked beneath the surface. Around the arena, students exchanged uncertain glances. Many had expected a confrontation. Instead, they were witnessing something they did not fully understand. Emma was offering him an exit, a chance to end everything before it went further. Cale looked around at the crowd. Thousands of eyes stared back. The attention that once energized him now seemed heavier somehow. You think you know me? He finally asked. Emma shook her head. No. Then why are you standing here? The answer came without hesitation. Because someone should have. A murmur spread through the audience. The younger volunteer who had left the platform earlier watched from the front rows, his expression filled with confusion and gratitude. Professor Vance remained motionless in the stands. He knew something important was happening. Not a fight. Something larger. A lesson. Cale laughed once, but the sound lacked conviction. Everyone keeps acting like you're special. Emma said nothing. I searched every record I could access. He took a slow breath. Nothing. The giant display screens above the arena suddenly flickered. At first nobody noticed. Then the images changed. Leadership statistics disappeared. Exercise schedules vanished. Lines of authorization codes began scrolling across every screen in the building. Confused voices rose from the crowd. Faculty members checked their communicators. Security personnel exchanged alarmed looks. Professor Vance immediately stood. He recognized the access signatures appearing across the displays. Those codes came from far above Academy administration, far above faculty authority, even above Alliance military channels. Every screen abruptly froze. Then a single document appeared. Classified student record. Emma Carter. Gasps echoed through the arena. Emma looked up slowly. Her expression revealed no surprise. The file continued scrolling automatically. Most sections remained sealed. Entire paragraphs appeared as blacked-out blocks of restricted information. Yet enough remained visible to change the atmosphere instantly. Environmental adaptation certification. Extreme gravity qualification. Advanced survival endorsements. Hazard planet operations clearance. Alliance emergency response citations. The crowd fell silent again. Students stared upward. Many had never seen those classifications before. Others recognized them immediately and turned pale. Professor Vance closed his eyes briefly. Someone had overridden every security protocol in the academy. The final page appeared. A simple notation near the bottom. Subject completed program Aegis survival trials. Status: sole successful participant. This time nobody spoke at all. Even Kale seemed unable to process what he was reading. Program Aegis had become something close to myth in military circles. Most believed it had been canceled decades ago. Others claimed it never existed. Yet there it was. Confirmed. Documented. Real. Emma remained exactly where she was. She did not appear proud. She did not appear embarrassed. If anything, she looked tired. Very tired. The screens displayed one final message before shutting down completely. Authorized personnel note. Subject has consistently demonstrated exceptional restraint under extreme conditions. Recommendation: do not confuse restraint with limitation. The arena seemed smaller afterward. Quieter. As if every person present had suddenly realized they were missing part of the story. Kale slowly lowered his gaze from the darkened screens. The certainty that had driven him for days was gone. In its place stood something unfamiliar. Understanding. Not complete understanding. Just enough to recognize how little he actually knew. Emma met his eyes one last time. Now you understand why I told you to walk away. The words contained no triumph. No judgment. Only honesty. And somewhere in the vast silence that followed, an entire academy began to realize that the most remarkable thing about Emma Carter was not what she could do. It was how hard she had worked to never have to do it. The arena did not erupt into applause. It did not explode into celebration or outrage. Instead, something far rarer happened. 10,000 people sat in complete silence and reconsidered everything they thought they knew. The giant display screens remained dark overhead. The bright arena lights reflected across the polished floor. Somewhere in the upper levels, a maintenance drone continued its assigned route as if nothing important had occurred. Yet everyone present understood that something had changed. Not in the academy. In themselves. Kale stood motionless at the center of the arena. For perhaps the first time in his life, there was no audience to impress. No reputation to defend. No victory to claim. Only truth. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that arrived quietly and stayed forever. Emma watched him for a moment. Then she turned toward the exit. The crowd parted almost immediately. No announcement instructed them to move. No authority figure issued commands. People simply stepped aside. Students who had never spoken to her before lowered their eyes respectfully as she passed. Others watched with expressions that mixed curiosity, admiration, and confusion. None of them truly understood her, but they understood enough. Professor Vance met her near the arena entrance. For several seconds, neither spoke. The noise of the crowd remained distant behind them. Finally, the professor released a slow breath. You stayed. Emma looked toward the corridor ahead. Someone needed to. You could have left. Yes. The professor nodded. Most people would have. A faint smile touched her face. That is why someone had to stay. Together, they stepped into the quieter hall beyond the arena. The artificial lighting seemed softer there. Cooler. More peaceful. Behind them, academy officials were already trying to determine who had released the classified records. Emma suspected they would never find the answer. Some things appeared exactly when they were needed and disappeared just as quickly. By the following morning, stories had spread across every department on campus. Students discussed the arena in cafeterias, lecture halls, training facilities, and dormitories. Some focused on the classified program. Others discussed the warnings hidden inside her file. But the stories that lasted longest were not about any of those things. They were about a quiet student who could have sought attention at any moment and spent years avoiding it instead. They were about someone who possessed every reason to feel superior and chose humility. They were about restraint. Several days later, Emma returned to the Biodome Gardens. The reflecting pool shimmered beneath artificial moonlight. Leaves rustled gently overhead. For the first time in weeks, nobody followed her. Nobody questioned her. Nobody demanded explanations. The academy had finally learned the lesson she had been trying to teach without words. Strength was easy to admire. Restraint required wisdom. Footsteps approached along the garden path. Emma looked up. Kale stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. Not hostile, not tense, simply honest. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. Emma studied the ripples crossing the water. "Probably." To his credit, he laughed softly. "That is fair." Another quiet moment passed. Then Kale extended a hand. Not as a challenge, not as a performance, as a gesture of respect. Emma looked at it briefly before accepting. The handshake lasted only a second, yet somehow it carried more meaning than all their previous conversations combined. When he left, she remained beside the pool watching reflected starlight dance across the surface. Above the biodome ceiling, real stars glimmered in the darkness beyond. Foshed, silent, endless. Emma had spent years learning difficult lessons about survival, endurance, and strength. Yet the lesson she valued most was much simpler. The strongest people were not the ones capable of winning every conflict. They were the ones who understood which conflicts were not worth having. Somewhere across the academy, students continued debating stories they only partially understood. Somewhere beyond the academy, entire worlds continued forming opinions about humanity. Emma smiled faintly at the thought. Then she looked toward the stars. In a galaxy fascinated by power, what truly set humans apart was never their strength. It was their ability to choose mercy when strength would have been easier.